Well, hello guys. My name is John Angga Christian. I'm from 2021 C. Mm, Today I'm gonna make a video about appreciations of poem that made by W.H. Auden, and the title is Another Time. Before we started, um, please please enjoy my video. If I said something wrong or there is a noise in this video, I'm so sorry for it. So let's be started. The first I'm gonna explain is about the background of W.H. Auden. W.H. Auden, or you can call it Winston Hughes Auden. He was born in York, England on February 21 on 1907. He moved to Birmingham during childhood and was educated at Christ Church, Oxford. And then, as a young man, he was influenced by the poetry of Thomas Hardy and Robert Frost, as well as William Blake, Emily Dickinson, Gerard Manley Hopkins, and Old English verse. Just for your information, the poets that I mentioned is all of them are famous works. They have famous poems, and they are famous in in that time. Um, let's we continue. At Oxford, his preciosity as a poet was immediately apparent, and he formed lifelong friendship with two fellow writers, and the friend is Stephen Spender and Christopher Asherwood. And then in 1928, Auden's collections poems was privately printed, but it wasn't until 1930 when another collection titled Poems, though its content were different, was published, that Auden was established as the leading voice of a new generation. Ever since, Auden has been admired for his unsurpassed technical virtuosity and an ability to write poems in nearly every imaginable verse form. The incorporation and his work of popular culture, current events, and vernacular speech, and also for the vast range of his intellect, which drew easily from an extraordinary variety of literatures, art forms, social and political theories, and then scientific and technical information. He had a remarkable wit, and often mimic and writing styles of other poets such as Dickinson's, W.B. Yeats, and then Henry James. His poetry frequently recounts literary or metaphorical journey or quest, and his travels provide rich material for his verse. uh, W.H. Auden is very famous and have a lot of famous friends in that time. Even that he is school at the famous school, and he is still smart in the school. So when and the next is continue the Auden backgrounds. Auden visited Germany, Iceland, and China, served in Spanish Civil War, and then in 1939 moved to the United States, where he met his lover, Chester Coleman. It is his wife, Chester Coleman, and became an American citizen. So before he met his love, Chester Coleman, he lived in England. So when he met Chester Coleman, his love, so he moved to America and become a American citizen. His own belief changed radically. His own belief changed radically between his youthful career in England, when he was an ardent advocate of socialism and Freudian psychoanalysis, and his later phase in America, when his central preoccupation became Christianity and the theology of modern Protestant theologians. A prolific writer, Auden was also known as a playwright, librettist, editor, and essayist. Generally considered the greatest English poet of the 20th century, his work has exerted a major influence on succeeding generations of poets on both sides of Atlantic. And then W.H. Auden also served as a counselor of the Academy of American Poets from 1954 to 1973 and divided most of the second half of his life between residence in New York City and Australia. He died in Vienna on September 29 and the year is 1973. I have explained about the life of W.H. Auden. Oh no, I'm sorry. I have explained the background of W.H. Auden, and now I'm gonna explain and tell the stories about the life of W.H. Auden. Before we get into the poem, so his education followed the standard pattern of for children in the middle and upper classes. At 8, he was sent away from St. Edmund's Preparatory School in Surrey, and at 13 to a public school or semi-private school, I think, at Gresham's at Holt in Norfolk. Auden intended to be a mining engineer, so what he have a dream when he when his school is he want to be a mining engineer, but no wonder she's to become a famous poet in the whole world. And he was interested in primarily in science. He was specialized in biology. By 1922, he had discovered his vocation as a poet. So before it all started, he had many dreams besides the poets or poems writers. But in 1922, he has discovered his vocation or his passion as a poet. And 2 years later, his first poem was published in public school first, and then in 1925 he entered the University of Oxford, or in that time they call the school is Christ Church, where he established a formidable reputation as a poet and sage, having a strong influence on such other literary intellectuals as C.D. Lewis. C.D. Lewis, a poet laureate in 1968. Louis MacNeice and then Stephen Spender, who printed by hand the first collections of Auden's poems in 1928. Though their names were often linked with his as poets of the so-called Auden generation, the notion of an Auden's group dedicated to revolutionary politics was largely a journalistic invention upon graduating from Oxford in 1928. Auden, over a year abroad by his parents, chose Berlin rather than the Paris by which the previous literary generation had been fascinated. He fell in love with the German language and was influenced by its poetry. So W.H. Auden is living everywhere, in England and then in Germany and then in America. So besides influenced by poetry, and then he influenced by cabaret songs and then plays, especially those by Bertolt Brecht, and he returned to become a schoolmaster in Scotland and England for the next 5 years. There's a long story life for W.H. Auden, and he have a many unique and amazing stories in his life. In his collection short poems, Auden divides his career into the four periods. The first extends from 1927, when he was still an undergraduate. So at 1927, he not yet graduated from his schools. Through the Aratus of 1932, the curate paid on both sides, which along with poems established Auden's reputation in 1930. Best reveals the imperfectly fused but fascinating amalgam of materials from the Icelandic sagas, Old English poetry, public school stories, Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, and other psychologists, and schoolboy humor that enters into all these works. These poems are uneven and often obscure, pulled in contrary directions by the subjective impulse to fantasy, thematic and unconscious, and the objective impulse to a diagnosis of ills of society and the psychological and moral defects of the individual who constitute it. Though the social and political implications of the poetry attracted most attention, the psychological aspect is primary. The notion of poetry as a kind of therapy, performing a function of somehow analogous to the psychological, remains fundamental in Auden. And that was the first period, and then what I'm gonna tell, and then I'm gonna tell the stories about the second period, and the year is 1933 until 1938. Is that in which Auden was the hero of the left, continuing the analysis of the evils of capitalist society. He also warned of the rise of the totalitarianism in on this island, and in the year of 1937 in Britain, Look Stranger in 1936. His verse became more open in texture and accessible to a larger public. And then for a group theater, a society that put on experimental and non-commercial plays in London, he wrote The Dance of Death. The Dance of Death is a musical propaganda play. And then 3 plays in the collaboration with Christopher Isherwood, Auden's friend since preparatory school. The Dog Beneath the Skin, it's at 1935, and then Essence of F6, it was 1936, and then On the Frontier at 1938. Auden also wrote commentaries for documentary films, including a classic of that genre, Night Mail, and Night Mail is the year is at 1936, and then numerous essays and book reviews and reportage, most notably on a trip to Iceland with McNice, described in Letters from Iceland in 1937, and a trip to China with Isherwood that was the basis of Journey to the War in 1939. Auden visits Spain briefly in 1937. His poem Spain at 1937 being the only immediate result by the visit, according to his later recollections, marked the beginning both of his delusions with the left on and of his return to Christianity. So we continue in 1936. He married Erika Mann, the daughter of a German novelist, Thomas Mann. In the order to provide her with a British passport, when he and Isherwood went to China, they crossed the United States both ways, and on the return journey, they both decide to settle there in January 1939. Both did so. And then is the third period. The third period is at 1939 until 1946. Auden became an American citizen and underwent decisive change in his religious and intellectual perspective. Another time, in 1940, contained some of his best songs and topical verse, and The Double Man contained New Year Letter, which provide the title of British edition in 1941, embodies his position of the verge of commitment to Christianity, the beliefs and attitudes that are basic to Auden's work after 1940 are defined for the three long poems released in the Christmas Oratorio for the time being at 1944. Aesthetic in the same volume C and The Mirror, a quasi-dramatic commentary on William Shakespeare's The Tempest, and Social Psychological in the Age of Anxiety at 1947. The Berg, a cloak that won Auden the Pulitzer Prize in 1948, Conrad for Auden, and then Auden wrote no long poems after that. So the fourth period of Auden's life is began in 1948, when Auden established the pattern of living in New York City each year to spend the month from April to October in Europe. From 1948 to 1957, his summer residence was the Italian island in Ischia. In the latter year, he bought a farmhouse in Kirchsteden, Austria, where he then spent his summers. In The Shield of Achilles, in 1955, Homage to Clio, 1960, About the House, 1965, and City Without Falls at 1969 are sequence of poems arranged according to an external pattern: canonical hours, type of landscape, and then room of a house. With Chester Coleman, his wife, an American poet and a close friend who lived with him for more than 20 years, he rehabilitated the art of the opera libretto. Their best-known collaborations are The Rake's Progress at 1951 for Igor Stravinsky, Elegy for Young Lovers at 1961, and then The Bassarit at 1966. For Hans Werner, Hans, and Love Labor Last for Nicholas Nabokov, they also edited an Elizabethan songbook in 1956. And then in 1962, Auden published a volume of criticism of Dyer Hans, and in 1970, a commonplace book, A Certain Word. He spent much time on editing and translating. Notably, he collected poems of Saint John Pearce in 1972. So, in 1972, Auden transferred his winter residence from New York City to Oxford, where he was an honorary fellow at Christ Church College. Of the numerous honors conferred on Auden in this last period, the Bollingen Prize in 1953, the National Book Award in 1956, and the professorship in poetry at Oxford in 1956 to 1961 may be mentioned. So that was the life of W.H. Auden. There's long stories, and the story is quite amazing, and made us curious to hear all of his stories and all of his works and all of his journey. So the next what I'm gonna explain is about the legacy that left by W.H. Auden. In the early 1930s, W.H. Auden was acclaimed prematurely by some as the foremost poet, then writing in English on the disputed ground that his poetry was more relevant to contemporary social and political realities than that of T.S. Eliot and William Butler Yeats, who previously had shared the summit by the time of Eliot's death in 1965. Poor Eliot, because he is dead in that time. However, a convincing case could be made for assertion that Auden was indeed Eliot's successor, as Eliot had inherited sole claim to supremacy when Yeats died in 1939. Auden was a poet far more copious and varied than Eliot and far more uneven. He tried to interpret the times, to diagnose the ills of society and deal with intellectual and moral problems of public concern. But the need to express the inner world of fancy and dreams was equally apparent, and hence the poetry is sometimes bewildering. If the poems taken individually are often obscure, especially the earlier ones, they create, when taken together, a meaningful poetic cosmos with symbolic landscapes and mythical characters and situations. In his later years, Auden ordered the word of his poetry and made it easier of access. He collected his poems, revised them, and presented them chronologically in two volumes. The first volume is collect short poems in 1927 until 1957, and then the second volume is collected longer poems in 1969. So I'm gonna tell you guys about the famous works that made by Auden. The famous work means all the poems that really famous that made by Auden. The first is Lullaby, and then Autumn Songs, and the third is Night Mail. The fourth is Missy the Box Art, and fifth is In Memory of W.B. Yeats, and the sixth is The Shield of Achilles. Seventh is September 1, 1939, and eighth is On the Circuit. Ninth is The Unknown Citizens, and the last is 10. The famous work is If I Could Tell You. I think the last poem is about romantic poems that made by W.H. Auden. So after all of this, I'm gonna tell the poets that I'm going to appreciate. Is the title is Another Time. Before I start it, I'm gonna read the poem for for you guys. Okay, let me start it. For us, like any other fugitive, like the numberless flowers that cannot number, and all the beasts that need not remember, it's today in which we live. So many try to say not now, so many have forgotten how to say I am and will be, lost if they could in history, bowing for instance with such old world grace to a proper flag in the proper place, muttering like ancients as they storm upstairs, of mine and his or ours and theirs, just as if time were what they used to will, when it was given with the possession still, just as if they were wrong, in no more wishing to belong. No wonder then so many die or grieve, so many are so lonely as they die. No one has yet believed or like a lie, another time has another lives the life. That is the poems that made by Eldens. It's a beautiful poems and I love it very much. The metaphors is very deep, and I think the poems is tell us about the sadness because in the fifth stanza, he says that no wonder then so many die or grieve, so many are so lonely as they die. No one has just believed or like a lie, another time has other lives life. Uh, because of that sentence or that stanza, I think the poems is describes or have a emotions of sadness. So we continue. I'm gonna analyze the poems, then another time poems. So another time is the poem initially until when it was first published in 1940 by the Anglo-American poet W.H. Auden in 1907 until 1973. Like many of Auden's greatest poems, Another Time is that ounce disarmingly clear in its language and hauntingly explicit in its meaning. Okay, we continue it. Another Time, the eventual title that Auden gave to this poem, which initially was entitled other than with its opening line, for us like any other fugitive, gives a clue to the poem's subject, as does the word fugitive. In that opening line, the poem is first and foremost about people who fly away from the present moment in search of meaningful allegiance to national or political causes, but who are cheating themselves, because the truth is that today it is today in which we live. However, as Auden continues, the problem is that many people would rather forget here and now. They try to say not now, attempting to get away from the reality with which their lives, whether they like it or not, are bound up. They have lost their sense of individual purpose and would rather lose themselves in a past that has become irrelevant to a modern age. And then in the third stanza, Auden elaborates on this point. These people bow in an old-fashioned act of reverence to a flag, observing the ceremony of paying homage to their country, giving credence to an outdated concept of nationalism. They consume, as the ancients were centuries ago, with the idea of tribalism, of belonging or not belonging. Things are either mine or they are his or ours or theirs. They are never shared or pluralist. Things become a little knottier and more enigmatic in the fourth stanza, as Auden casts his language in the subjunctive mode of just as ifs. The gist, though, is that such people are acting as if times is there to be ordered about and possessed by them, as if they could will it to do their bidding. But then the second half of the stanza becomes even trickier, with another just as if statement which implies through the subjunctive that Auden thinks these people are not actually wrong. Just as they were wrong suggests, after all, that they are not wrong after all. One way to analyze these two lines is to interpret them as ironic, but this seems unconvincing. A more productive avenue, however, might be to decide that Auden means exactly what he says, that these people, in not wishing to belong to the here and now, are actually out there right, because the here and now doesn't want their petty and narrow-minded nationalism and outdated attitudes. And then the final stanza, the fifth stanza, the analysis another time sees Auden acknowledging with characteristic sympathy the plight of these people. They die lonely and alone, feeling as though they are out of sync with their time, and they die of grief because the world is not the world they wish to live in. But the second half of this final stanza still observes that the world these people wish to will back into existence is a lie, and no one has said like a lie. This brings us to the final line of the poems, which provides its title, Another Time Has Other Lives to Life. That final line at once personifies time, although Auden retains the lowercase on time, refusing to give us some hackneyed old idea of old father time, suggesting that it is too busy living its my own life somewhere else, but in the line also hints at all those lives, all those people, especially younger, more pluralist and internationalist people who want to move to away from outmoded ideas of nationhood and to a new way of thinking about citizenships and belonging. Another time in this analysis of the line has lots of other lives it needs to make it live. Of course, Auden's lines are crisp and succinct, where are analyzed or attempt paraphrase of them must be blurred and conflated, making a mockery of his syntax. But that's the beauty of poetry. It doesn't obey the usual rules of language and sentence structure, as T.S. Eliot observed first its own system and punctuation. Nevertheless, a few puzzling things about Another Time remain. For instance, that penultimate line, no one has yet believed or like a lie. This seems like an odd thing for the poet who elsewhere wrote about Hitler's Germany that we have seen an mirrored face or ecstatic from one lie. Hitler's idea of nationalism was a lie that millions of Germans have been conned to believing, so how could Auden have written just a few years later that nobody has ever believed a lie? Is there an unspoken word no one dissent has yet believed or like a lie? Or is he questioning whether anyone truly believes such ideas, that those who bow reverently to a flag might tell themselves to believe in their country, but they know deep down that it's not true, like a Christian with very shaky faith? This is not an easy question to answer, and it remains perhaps the most troubling aspects of Auden's poem. Okay, to conclude on firmer ground, we might observe the curious verse from Auden's used from Another Time. The poem is written in quatrains, throughout, so far so consistent, but although the first stanza is rhyme, Abba, albeit with half rhyme or pararhyme on number and remember. The next three stanzas are all in rhyming couplets. AABB, however, we turn to the enclosed or envelope rhyme for the concluding stanza, with grief and leave being examples of pararhyme this time. So the last one is essentially this means that two stanzas which bookend the poems are envelope rhyme, and the whole poem is a sort of massive envelope with the same palindromic structure being used for the whole poem, as well as for these individual two stanzas. There are sense of deflations and disappointment, even thanks to the ABBA stanzas. Association with Tennyson in memoriam, and elegiac air to them, for a poem like Other Times about the death of an old way of living and believing. So that's all the poem appreciation from me. If I made a mistake or something wrong, please forgive me. That's all from me, and here's the text, here's the video. Enjoy it, and thank you for watching until the end. Thank you.